Welcome, everyone. We'll wait just another minute for more people to join in. Great. I think we can start. So thank you all for being with us today. This is a IRMA stakeholder feedback webinar on the management of physical stability. This is part of a series of live consultations that IRMA has been hosting over the last few weeks and going on until the end of January. And I'm Pierre de Pasquale, Standards Director at IRMA, and I'm here today with my colleagues Amy Boulanger, Michelle Smith, and Alan Septoff. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today, I'll be sharing with you the house rules for this live consultation. I'll explain what are the concrete and practical ways for you to contribute today. We'll go briefly over the IRMA standard revision process itself, and then we'll be sharing an overview of the proposed changes to address the management of physical stability today. And we'll have time for questions, answers, and live chat contribution and discussion. I'll say more about it just now. Next slide, please. The house rules for today. So reminding you that this event is hosted by IRMA. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be made publicly available on our websites afterwards. Participants may not post any unlawful, offensive, threatening, libelous, defamatory, obscene, or objectionable content. Remind you not to post or send or link to any hateful, degrading, criminal, or sensitive imagery or content. And do not advocate or promote intolerance or hate against other people. We also remind you to not post or send any spam or any content that would attempt to drive attention to unrelated products, services, or initiatives. Next slide, please. Why am I saying this? Well, you would have noticed that today, and if you haven't, please notice that the chat function of Zoom is open today. So this event represents one of the many opportunities in communication channels available for all stakeholders to contribute to the IRMA standard revision process. So we've set up multiple ways for you to contribute, including a dedicated online platform that you can find online at responsiblemining.net/commons2, the number 2. But today, and the purpose of the series of live consultations is really for you to be able to actively contribute and participate. So as I said, the chat function is open today. You can use it to share content with the whole audience. Please note that the chat cannot be used in an anonymous way. So if you use the chat to share content, it will be attributed to your name. Next slide, please. Unlike the Q&A function, which is also open and available today, you can find it at the bottom of your screen, and you can use it again to submit any comment, suggestion, feedback, question, concern, recommendation to IRMA. And with the Q&A function, you can, by ticking the send anonymously option, to submit your content in an anonymous way. And I'm really encouraging those of you who would have already read content or the draft standard on this particular chapter on the management of physical stability, or who already have experience with the 2018 standard for responsible mining, to already, as of now, start, sharing your recommendations, thinking, concerns, or appreciation with us and the rest of the attendees. Next slide, please. Yes, and important to remind that all the content that you're sharing with us today will be saved and considered by IRMA as part of the standard revision process. As with any other communication contribution channels that are available to stakeholders. This live consultation, we will consider and take everything into account. Next slide, please. So a few words about the IRMA revision process itself. Next slide, please. So IRMA is conducting a comprehensive revision of the standards. You would probably know that the IRMA standard for responsible mining was officially launched in 2018. It has been 5 years now, and it's very important and critical for IRMA to ensure that our standards and the IRMA system as a whole remains accountable to all sectors and all stakeholder groups, and to make sure it remains aligned with IRMA mission and vision. It's an opportunity for us, this revision process, to make sure the standard remains up to date. It's also an opportunity for us to add clarity where it's needed, to make the standard clearer, to make it more meaningful, more accessible for all stakeholders, including for implementing companies and auditors. It was also important for us to make sure the requirements are more auditable when needed. It's a great opportunity for us to add consistency within the standard between chapters that are similar, to make sure the structure and the flow is similar, and to make sure that we keep embedding good management systems, practice, and models throughout the standard. And it's also an opportunity for IRMA to fill gaps where IRMA may have fallen behind over the course of 5 years, or where new and emerging issues now require more attention or require attention from a standard on responsible mining and mineral value chains. Next slide, please. I was just mentioning here mineral value chains. This revision process is also instrumental and a very important moment for IRMA, because we're proposing to evolve and address key phases of the mineral supply chain. So building on the IRMA standard for responsible mining that was launched in 2018, and that covers only mining operations, so the extraction of primary material. Next slide, please. We are proposing in this new draft to combine the standard for responsible mining with 2 draft standards that IRMA published in 2021. The IRMA Ready Draft Standard that covers exploration and development of mining projects, and the Draft Standard for responsible mineral processing. And given the huge amount of overlap between these 3, we are proposing to integrate and unify them into one single standard, which is the draft, in its draft format at the moment, Standard for Responsible Mining and Mineral Processing 2.0. Next slide, please. And this draft, I think I'll turn to my colleague Amy to tell you more about the content of this draft.
Thanks so much, Pierre. What I'm going to tell you a few things about this draft is what it's not. First of all, it's not a board approved. So we are not sending you a document which is largely finished and where we're saying we think this is all right. And we just want your blessing on that content, but rather we are giving you a document that is a work in progress. The board has only approved it be released to catalyzed public consultation and to raise questions with you. So given that, when you flip through this document, you're going to see something, first of all, which is far longer than the end standard will be. It's very long because it's filled with many notes and questions to the reader. And those notes are framed in such a way that when you approach each chapter, you will see notes at the beginning of the chapter, providing you with context on a summary of why things are proposed to be changed, what we've learned on it, where the changes came from, learning from the first mines who have been audited, from the first communities, giving feedback on the process. So all of that context is there. And then where we have particularly challenging questions, where we have not gotten to resolution yet, where working group members from any sector we're evaluating the sticky questions of how best to create a best practice framework for auditing mines and driving value for improved practices. Where we couldn't get to those answers, there are consultation questions laid out there. Having said that, you don't have to only look at the questions we ask. You are welcome to provide feedback on any aspect of the standard from 2018 or new proposals. We will take feedback to improve this document in any aspect of its work. And for any of you who prefer to read this in an Excel version instead of the long narrative version, we have that option as well. Back to you, Pierre.
Thank you so much, Amy. And also reminding everyone or informing you that there is a Spanish version of the standard. So the full standard has been translated into Spanish and is available on our website. And this draft has been informed by lots of learning, and in particular, the experience that IRMA has been able to gather from the initial IRMA audits. So there has been already 4 independent audits that have led to a public audit reports, and there are about 10 more independent audit that will soon be publicly available, and a number of additional ones that are under in progress right now. We've also used the learning and knowledge from the review we did of other standards, the also revision and review of best practice and the evolution of society's expectations as reflected and articulated in other norms and initiatives. We've also taken into account all the comments that we received on the 2 draft standards that I mentioned before, on exploration, development, and mineral processing. And we've also benefited from our ongoing stakeholder engagement activities and the work of expert working groups. Next slide, please. So the public consultation is open. We released this draft at the end of October. It's a 90-day public comment period. So you have until the end of January the 26th to be accurate, to share your comments, recommendations, and feedback. All comments will be considered equally and in an objective manner, including, and I'm saying it again, everything that we'll receive today during this live consultation. All the comments and feedback that we'll receive will be included in a public summary, and we'll make it publicly available. All comments and content can be treated anonymously. Again, today you can use the option in the Q&A function, but whenever you submit content as part of this public consultation period, you can also inform IRMA that you want it to be treated confidentially. Next slide, please. In terms of the ways for you to contribute, I've already mentioned the online platform that you can find online on our website. We've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. You can go through every single chapter and leave comments and feedback at every requirement level. And if you prefer to send more general or high-level comments, there's also an option for that if you scroll down at the very bottom of the platform. Next slide, please. You can also use more traditional ways and communication channels. We have a dedicated email address, comments@responsiblemining.net. You can use our WhatsApp line or submit contribution to our physical address. Next slide, please. So now we'll go through the proposed changes and the evolution that we are proposing for the IRMA standard on the management of physical stability. Next slide, please. So we're proposing this is a new chapter, and I'll say more about it in the next slide. But the intent of this chapter on physical stability is for mining entity, so at mine sites or at mineral processing facilities, to manage wastes, materials, and facilities in a manner that minimizes their short and long-term physical risks, and in a manner that protects workers as well as the human rights, health, and safety of communities and future land and water users. This chapter is potentially applicable to all exploration, mining, and mineral processing projects and operations. But clearly, depending on the kinds of facilities that are on site, not all requirements will be relevant in all cases, and I'll say more about it in a later slide. Next slide, please. So as an upfront explanation or reminder for those of you who've already had a chance to look at the draft standard and the draft chapter, we're proposing a new chapter here to serve a new approach. In the 2018 mining standard, so the IRMA standard for responsible mining, there is a chapter numbered 4.1 on waste and materials management. And this one is really focused on mine waste. That includes tailings, waste rock, spent ore, and waste that are generated during the mineral processing processes. But there wasn't a lot of attention paid to understanding and managing the risk from chemicals, so the input chemicals that are used in the processing, and other substances. And also there was little attention paid to the management of non-mine wastes, which can be generated in huge volumes at large-scale mines and large-scale processing facilities. Next slide, please. And so we're proposing to separate the aspects of waste management into two chapters. So yesterday, we actually hosted a live consultation on the revised chapter 4.1, so with the same numbering, waste and materials management. And we're proposing for it now to focus on the management of all types of waste and materials, so also the input chemicals and pollution-related aspects of waste. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we're proposing this new chapter, so currently numbered 4.x, called the Management of Physical Stability. And this one has been designed to evaluate the physical stability risks related not only to mine waste, but also to other facilities that would be present at a mine site or a mineral processing facility. Next slide, please. So in terms of the practical changes and elements in this chapter, so part of it actually comes from the original chapter 4.1 in the 2018 mining standard. So everything that was related to facilities, facility management, has been moved and taken back into this new chapter. And we've also complemented and added a number of new requirements and elements. In terms of structuring this chapter, we've really tried to organize it in the same way that other, social and environmental responsibility chapters are structured, with requirements around first the scoping of facilities, so understanding them, determining whether they have potential physical stability risks associated. This will then inform requirements around the management of physical stability for both non-critical facilities and then separately for critical facilities, together with a number of design and risk assessment criteria. Then we have criteria and requirements on the oversight and review processes for critical facilities. And we have finally the very important transparency dimension that you will find and that you find throughout the IRMA standard on reporting and disclosure. Next slide, please. And I mentioned in introduction the importance for IRMA to embed throughout the standard some, practical considerations around good management practice and management systems approach. And it is really down to operationalizing continuous improvements. How do you in practice promote and audit and assure that mining companies and mineral processing companies are indeed working towards continuous improvement? And one way to simplify this and to put it in a visual way is to summarize it through the plan, do, check, act continuous improvement cycle. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see how the different steps that I just presented as the structure of the chapter do map out to this plan, do, check, act cycle. So everything with regard to the scoping, uh, initial assessment, design of the facilities really aligns with the planning phase. The do is aligned with the management of the different facilities, so having management plans in place and implementing them. The oversight of the critical facility is the check elements, and then the review processes where you would have all the corrective action and the response to the monitoring and evaluation to then continuously feed into better and stronger understanding management plan and prevention or mitigation measures. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. And then I mentioned before the strong transparency or open data dimension around reporting and disclosure, which you also find in this chapter. Next slide, please. Now we can go to some more practical elements that you will find in this chapter. And it was very important to already, acknowledge it in this presentation that one of the driver for IRMA in revising and revisiting this chapter was the global tailings review process and the global industry standard for tailings management that was published in 2021 as a result of this multi-stakeholder effort. And IRMA was actually involved and contributed to this discussions. There are a number of overlaps between the global industry standard for tailings management and the IRMA standard, but very important to remind everyone and ourselves that the global standard for tailings focuses only on the management of tailings and to a very large extent to new tailings facilities. So it's completely different and much smaller and narrower in scope than the 26th chapter IRMA standard. And it's also actually much narrower than these two chapters in the new draft standard that focuses on waste management and tailings management. Next slide, please. So clearly the intent of this chapter on the physical stability is not to duplicate the efforts that the Global Tailings Review has developed or any other industry standards, but it's really for us to align on critical requirements, apply them in a manner that covers the needs of all stakeholders, provides more transparency, and is articulated in a way that is also auditable and can be assured by independent audit. It's also for us to recognize that many facilities, not just the tailings storage facilities, can have risks and can result in catastrophic failures, but also less severe stability failures that would still have damage and negative consequences. And these risks need to be recognized and addressed. This was very important for us to go beyond tailings facilities in this chapter. Next slide, please. And I'll show a slide later on how this chapter do align and reflect partially or fully a number of requirements and criteria that you will find in the global industry standard for tailings management. We're also using this opportunity to fill a number of gaps. And when reviewing the mining standard, the 2018 version, around physical stability risks, we realized that there was a need to include more or new requirements on the identification and characterization of risks. So making sure that there are in the process step for entities to determine which facilities may have a potential for catastrophic failure and actually look at the different levels of risks. And there was no explicit requirement that outlined the process for determining a failure consequence classification. So not looking at the risk level and the potential for a failure or breach, but rating if a facility were to experience a catastrophic failure, regardless of the likeliness, but rating the severity of the human, environmental, and economic consequences that this would generate. Next slide, please. So to fill these gaps, on the first element, on the understanding and how to determine the levels of risk, we're proposing to include scoping and assessment requirements. So these are largely under the criterion 4.x. You will find in the new draft standard. Next slide, please. And on the consequence classification, we're proposing to include an explicit requirement that outlines the process for determining and reviewing regularly this failure consequence classification. And this is in line with the table and definition that were agreed on as part of the global industry standard for tailings management. So you can see the table, it's been adapted in the draft standard where the different criteria for defining whether it would have a low consequence, significant, high, very high, or extreme consequence in case of any failure or breach. Next slide, please. We're also proposing to fill a number of gaps and making sure this chapter is consistent with other chapters. We're proposing a comprehensive set of requirements to make sure that all potential risks are managed. And when we say all risks, we have actually included an annex that lists all the mitigation criteria, design criteria to manage these facilities. And so you'll find it in the draft. It's the Annex 4.XA that has a comprehensive list of best practice, which look at stability analysis, and then looked at a number of context or topic specific on stormwater, access roads, surface mines, underground mine, subsidence from underground fluid extraction, storing, stockpiling from underground and surface mines, waste storage facilities that are associated with mineral processing, and water reservoirs that, again, are not tailings facilities, but are large and important facilities that can have risks associated with. Next slide, please. We're also proposing to include enhanced quality control, monitoring, maintenance, and oversight of facilities that have critical risks, again, regardless of what's being stored or the end use of these facilities, if it's so not only tailing storage facilities, but we've added here a number of requirements that also align with how other chapters are structured, and you can think back of this plan, do, check, act, continuous improvement cycle. Next slide, please. We're also adding consistency in this chapter by proposing a number of new requirements and revised requirements on documentation and public reporting and public data sharing. And we also, again, align with other chapters and other requirements, a requirement for the entity to offer to provide assistance to stakeholders from affected communities when it comes to selecting and hiring independent experts to advise them and support them on physical stability risks and management of facilities. And this is also aligned with, for example, the global tailings standard, where there is a need and requirement around effective stakeholder engagement. So that was one practical way for IRMA to also articulate this. Next slide, please. I think the screen, we're missing a little bit of the left-hand side. Now we can see it full. So I mentioned it before, and what I'm sharing here is a summary table. You can find this in the notes that Amy mentioned under every requirement. We've mentioned where there are strong direct or partial link between the requirements and the work of the global industry standard on tailings. And here you can see that for a number of them, if you look at the column on the right-hand side, the related references, there are a number of requirements that are aligned. But because we're also covering facilities that do not store tailings, and we're also being slightly more prescriptive on a number of topics. Some requirements, you won't find them in the global industry standard for tailings management. So again, coming from this perspective of complementing, filling gaps, and advancing the work on physical stability of all facilities, not only tailings facilities. And where we could, clearly there is alignment and a high level of alignment with the work of the global industry standard. Next slide, please. In this next table, I'm showing this is an extract from a document that you can find on the IRMA website under resources. Because IRMA is proposing now to integrate all phases from exploration to project development to the permitting of project to the actual mining operation and mineral processing, we have developed and published a document that is also open for public comments at the moment that shows for every requirement whether it is applicable and how it is applicable to these different phases. So I said in the beginning that this chapter is potentially applicable to exploration, mining, and mineral processing. You see here in this table that under exploration stage 1 and stage 2, some of the most initial exploration work, and then under exploration stage 3, where there's actually potentially some not many facilities and infrastructures being built. Most of the requirements are actually not required. So that's important for any exploration companies looking at this standard. And then gradually from the project development phase where initial assessment, design, and construction of facilities can happen, and then gradually into the permitting and the operating phases where you see that all requirements can become applicable. And clearly, based on the results and the outcomes of the scoping work and the identification work that is required in the IRMA standard, if there are no critical facilities identified, and in particular, if there's no critical tailings facilities and no critical non-tailings facilities on site, there are a number of criteria, actually more than half, that will not be applicable because from 4.x.3 through 4.x.6, these are only applicable when critical facilities are present on site. So also a way for entities to understand how and what the number of requirements that they actually need to look at and work on. Next slide, please. In terms of comparing the 2018 standard, so at the moment, as I said, we have one chapter on waste and materials management, and part of this looks at the physical stability risk of facilities. We have 28 requirements in the 2018 standard. Now that we've split this issue into two separate chapters and that we've expanded the scope to also look at non-mine waste and non-tailings facilities, we have those two chapters in the draft standard on waste and materials management with 24 requirements and the management of physical stability with 28 requirements. So that may look like a lot more requirements, but if we go to the next slide, in practice, in this chapter, the brand new elements that cannot be found in the 2018 standard are not so many. There are 6 dimensions, and some of them are covered through multiple requirements. We've also learned in the 2018 standard and its implementation and audit in the audit processes that a number of requirements, it was clearer to separate them and split them into multiple requirements. So that makes the number higher. But what you will find here that is not in the 2018 standard, the fact that we include non-mine waste facilities, as I've said it now multiple times, new requirements for a thorough scoping process of all the facilities to understand the potential risks when it comes to the physical stability of these facilities and structures. The consequence classification approach clearly is a new addition. There are more requirements on information sharing from the entity with affected communities and relevant stakeholders, with a number of cross-reference, also with other chapters around emergency situations. We are proposing new requirements on how you manage change over time, and there are also requirements for the oversight of the quality of engineering work at all critical facilities. Next slide, please. And again, inviting you to, already send your comments. And I see that, the chat is already being used. You can also use the Q&A function today if you wish, in particular, if you want to send anonymous comment and content. But before we close the presentation and we move to the question and the conversation, I have pulled out a few consultation questions. So when Amy presented in introduction the content of the draft standard, she mentioned the consultation questions. So we're welcoming content and feedback and inputs on everything in the draft standard, but we've tried to guide readers to some of the most challenging, sometimes controversial issues and questions that we have found in the standard, and we would really like to have answers, comments, reflections, thinking on. So first of all, we're proposing a new approach, and this also applied to the waste and materials management chapter that I presented yesterday. And apologies if you see at the very top of this slide, it says waste and materials management, but that is applicable to both chapters. We're proposing a wider scope, but we think this is clearer between, on the one hand, the management of waste and materials, and on the other hand, the physical stability of all facilities, which is what is covered in this chapter. So what do you think about it? Any feedback, opinion, comments, support, reflections on this new approach are warmly welcome. Next slide, please. And then on some more specific elements of this chapter, I mentioned in one of the slides that we're proposing an annex and new guidance on best practice for design of facilities and the management of facilities. Again, we'd like to hear from you if you agree with this proposition to have a guidance that will actually inform how the auditors assess the responsible management and responsible design of these facilities. If you don't think this is the way forward, how would you suggest auditors can determine whether sites are managing and designing their facilities in a way that can actually prevent and mitigate instability and physical stability risks? At the first question on this guidance. And then if we go to the next slide, about the criteria themselves, do you agree that these criteria follow, for example, the well-established Canada Dam Association criteria? And if not, why not? And also clearly other design criteria, other association, other standards and norms that have been defined and agreed on over the years on best practice for facility management. And do you agree with the inclusion of, for example, the slope stability criteria that we're proposing in the guidance? And again, if you don't agree, we would really love to hear the rationale and your recommendation and propositions to improve this new draft. This is really an opportunity and I think a wonderful moment for everybody to really contribute to the future of the IRMA standard and the future of the IRMA system. And next slide, I have just one more consultation question that I wanted to share with you, and it comes to existing facilities. So in particular, tailing storage facilities that are already commissioned and in operation and used to store tailings. In the global industry standard for tailings management, it's largely focused on new tailings facilities, which clearly has a much smaller scope and potential for impact. But they've made additional allowance allowances for existing facilities if they can demonstrate that it's not possible for them to upgrade the facility to meet best practice criteria. And so, do you think that IRMA should also follow that route and allow entities to demonstrate that they could not upgrade and they had good reasons for it? And then in that case, the approach of the global industry standard is to require from entities that they can demonstrate that even if the upgrades are not aligned with best practice, they still take place to minimize risk to as low as reasonably practical risk at those sites. So that's one approach. It's not the approach we've followed in the current draft, but it's a question we would really like to have your opinion and feedback on. And as a follow-up question, if we go to the last slide, still on existing facilities, one option could be for IRMA to cap the score and the rating that an entity can get in this situation. So if not the best, if not all best practice design criteria are met, but there's still a demonstration by an entity that they've done everything they could to reduce the risk to the lowest practical risk, then we could give them a substantially meet. So it's one of the intermediate scoring level in the IRMA system. And again, asking you if you think that's an approach that could be acceptable. Is it something that you would support? And these are really meant to prompt your reflections and guide you. We know that the IRMA draft standard is long, in particular in this format where you have many notes and consultation questions. But these are the, we think, most critical and challenging issues or areas we would really like to have your feedback. And with that, I'll turn to my colleague, Amy, and I'm sure we'll go through some great comments and content questions already. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this coverage here, Pierre. And I invite everyone to please add questions into the chat if you have questions there, or you can go to the Q&A. You can send to the full group, or you can send just to host and panelists. So please feel free, even if you'd rather be somewhat anonymous, to use these tools, and you can share broadly. Pierre, there are a number of points in the chat which aren't so much questions as they are suggestions from Jan Morrill at Earthworks, who has provided very specific suggestions around how the different facilities specified to ensure protection of life, and also that in full form, so that data, a greatest amount of data is shared, not just summaries of data. And I'm coughing, so I will let Michelle add a bit more, but Jan, just want you to know we're capturing all of this and it will go into the log, and super helpful, super specific input. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Hi there. So I think some of these comments are really useful to share with the group, even if they're comments and not questions. So there was a series of comments around our definitions of critical and non-critical as they relate to the consequence matrix. And I think what is important maybe to pull out here is that I believe IRMA has modified the definition for our purposes. So in those consequence matrices, the level of that's identified as significant, which is where there could be loss of life of 1 to 10 people, appears to be kind of left out of some of our requirements. However, if you look at our definition under critical, we define critical as high, extremely high, or, and I apologize, I can't remember the highest level, and incidents where there could be, like where it's significant and there could still be a loss of life. So I think that's an important one to call out, where we have we have included essentially any potential loss of life comes under the definition of critical for us. And we've essentially split that category of significant so that if there's a potential loss of life, it goes in critical. If there's not, then it would be in non-critical. There is another comment. I think Amy covered this comment about the summary reporting and making sure that where we require summary reports that we're not losing important details, and that perhaps we consider requiring full documents. And then there's another comment about how we scope certain requirements. We currently say residential populations, individual households, public and private infrastructures within a 5-kilometer radius and 100 kilometers downstream. And the suggestion is that we add language that also requires specific documentation of hard to evacuate facilities, which might include prisons, elder care facilities, schools, and daycares. I think that I believe sums up the comments that we've received so far. I'll just say out there, repeating what Pierre has said, and Amy, that we welcome your comments either in the chat or in the Q&A function. As well as you're welcome to obviously leave this seminar or this webinar and go away and review this chapter again now with this kind of summary and discussion that Pierre's presented, and then provide us comments in writing as well.
And 2 more notes on that. If you've provided comments here into the chat, or if you provide them verbally, we just want to reassure you again, we are logging every single one of them. So you are welcomed to write them again and submit them in writing, but if you don't need to, we will absolutely capture each of these comments that are made here to informing the standard. We save the chat and put this in. And also this is being recorded. So if you would like to watch again as you read per Michelle's suggestion, you'll have access to this review for that to support you.
Thank you, Amy and Michelle. And perhaps one question that we also receive often around the critical requirements. For those who are familiar with the 2018 mining standard and the IRMA system, there are a number of critical requirements where if an entity cannot demonstrate that they substantially meet the requirement, it is not possible for them to claim any achievement level or score. We will still, proceed with the audit and make the audit report public, but they won't be able to claim a specific score such as IRMA 50 or IRMA 75 or IRMA 100. And in the 2023 draft standard that we've released this year, we're proposing to follow the same approach. In this particular chapter, we have kept a critical requirement around risk assessment for each critical facility. And thank you, Michelle, for reminding everyone that this definition of critical is not dependent on the consequence classification and the number of death and fatalities that could happen in case of failure, which is also a slightly different approach that many industry standard and even multi-stakeholder standard. So risk assessments are required critically for each critical facilities with appropriate documentation, appropriate teams, and that these risk assessments are updated every 3 years or sooner. That's the only critical requirement in this chapter. Bearing in mind that these chapters are not siloed, they are actually interconnected and interdependent. So throughout the IRMA standard, there are also other critical requirements around emergency preparedness, emergency response, fundamental rights, stakeholder engagement, information sharing. But this is also an area where all comments are welcome. And as I said before, this is really I think a very special moment for us and for everybody to drive and influence the future of the IRMA standard and collectively and constructively make it even better, even stronger and more meaningful and useful for everybody. So inviting you all again to think not only about these consultation questions that I shared or some specific points that we showed today, but looking at the IRMA standard as a whole, the rationale, the approach, and how you think the IRMA standard could help you, could serve your needs and demands among your stakeholder groups and interest. And I see that this is prompting a few other comments. So I don't know, Amy and Michelle, if you want to look at them. We still have a little bit of time.
I'll give you one, Pierre, and then if I cough, Michelle will give you the next one. So you have one question, which is related to the ban on upstream dam construction in a number of countries, and research showing that upstream dams are more susceptible to stability issues. This person would like to know, what was the rationale to not include requirements specific to upstream dams in the new version of the standard?
Well, and yeah, that's a good question. And we've been, I think, actually debating and discussing this again very recently. This is a draft standard, and so if we hear a lot of comments and recommendations that there should be a clear and explicit ban in the standard, is something that will be definitely considered. At the moment, given the high number of upstream dams that are still in operations and active around the world, we really try to look at a continuous improvement approach that could be efficient and acceptable. I think if you look at the guidance and the steps and the different requirements, I think it is likely that many facilities and entities where they have upstream dams won't be able to meet the best practice criteria and therefore won't be able to score highly on these requirements. But I guess a ban, like a strict ban, to make it meaningful and effective in the IRMA standard, that would probably require a critical requirement associated with. So at the moment, based on the guidance, many upstream dam wouldn't be able to score highly on the individual requirements of this chapter, but they would still be able to score on other requirements and on other chapters. I don't know if Amy or Misha, you want to add anything to that, but I think that's been the approach so far.
And I think the question is, is that the way that critical requirements have vaulted other issues, for example, dumping of waste to natural water bodies or human rights issues, should this be, because of its risk, be considered that critical? So I think it's a fair question asked. And I think some of the answer you've replied, Pierre, reflects also, there's another comment in the chat that slope stability is indeed an important design factor, as is the case with upstream dam facilities, but also note that that addressing risk there doesn't need to be driven to levels that some might see as unreasonable, which you're responding to as well here, Pierre, and that addressing best practice engineering and the size of the site and the height of the site all have factors, which is what I know some the issues that have gone in as well to weighing these things. The safety, yes, upstream dams have certainly become the most known and risky, and other sites can be risky depending on how well they're managed, water balance, height, size, all these other issues that are being raised as well. So I think both of these are very legitimate comments. And to Pierre's point, it won't just be the number of these. We're really going to weigh the good sense both of you have put in on these issues as we think about what should the IRMA standard reflect out in the world, because both of these points are valid points in the world right now. I don't know, Pierre, if there's anything you want to add on it, or Michelle.
Well, the one thing I can add is surely about the, I think this annex. Again, this is where I think Jan and Edward, you will find some of the, I think, more specific details on what is required in terms of design and management. I'm also very conscious that having things spelled out and explained in annexes and guidance material may not necessarily be the best way for all stakeholders to understand fully what is meant by particular requirements. I think it's an issue that we've seen and acknowledged and understood until now, with I think many people up to now not necessarily aware of, for example, the IRMA standard guidance, which is a a very long and detailed and comprehensive document that goes together with the IRMA standard. So again, any recommendations, suggestions on top of the internal work that IRMA has been doing and will still be doing to simplify and make things clearer and easier to understand would be very welcome and appreciated.
Pierre, I think that that wraps up the questions and comments that we've received today.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you again for your contribution, your attention. As Amy said now multiple times, we are recording, saving, logging all the content that you shared with us. And there's still time for you to look at the draft standard, think about it, and submit to IRMA your comments, content, recommendations, input via all the communication ways and channels that we presented today. And you will be able to find this recording, as with all the other topics that we covered with live consultations, very soon on our website. And there are many more live consultations and topics taking place still this week, next week, and then in January next year. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.